Hello, everyone, and welcome to my first episode about women in music. My name is Erin Colwitz, and I'm an associate professor of music at Northern Michigan University. I'm also the director of choirs, but I do teach just a little bit of music history. So I thought it might be a little fun today to talk about women in music during this quarantine time where we all might be a little bored. It might be fun to learn something new. One of my favorite women of all time in the history of music is Hildegard of Bingen, so I'm happy to be talking about her today. So let's go on and we'll talk a little bit about the background of music in the Middle Ages and also why we see so few women in music. Well, there are a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that women weren't really discussed as a topic until roughly the 1970s, when the field of musicology began to really open up. As a result, women rarely made it into textbooks. As of late, we have seen more and more women, more and more composers, more and more female identifying performers kind of creep their way into our textbooks, but we still are making headway in that regard. Very rarely have we seen female identifying musicologists prior to 1970. That is also changing, and as a result, we're seeing more and more research involving female composers, performers, conductors, and things of that nature. So we're very, very grateful to those musicologists, particularly other women in the field of women's studies, which has really sort of opened up a reason for us to sort of research women in music in particular. So luckily, things are changing, but we still have a lot to learn about the many, many women who've contributed to music, and not just Western music, women in other cultures as well that we just don't really have any record of per se. So we're still working on those things, and hopefully we'll see more in other cultures as well. So the early church, talking about the world of Hildegard, was very much a man's world. Men were only allowed to sing in church. The priests, the male priests, were the only ones allowed to actually say Mass. So when it came to working in a convent, the women were doing their daily canonical routines and saying their prayers, but it was really up to them to compose their own music. So a lot of this was happening sort of under the guise of, say, the priest or, say, the Vatican, but very little of it was codified until we get to the age, really, of Hildegard. So for the most part, these women were responsible for their own communal activity, which means that they were also taught basic literary skills and musical skills as well. So in some ways, during this time period, it was very advantageous for someone, for a child to be sort of given to a convent because, for one, they knew they'd have meals, they would be fed, and another would mean that they would become somewhat educated, although that certainly is debated. Women were not really allowed to be educated. Certainly people during this time were not even allowed to read the Bible. Many didn't even speak the languages that were presented in church or at Mass. So many people were sort of left in the dark, and that certainly included women, hence the term the Dark Ages. But the nuns kind of got around some of this in their own way, in part because they were secluded very often and could do some of their own things. Hildegard is a really special case because she was an extremely strong woman and had her own ideas about early feminism and things that we now sort of attribute to that movement. So the leadership roles for women were very, very few. Obviously, there could be an abbess, right, who was in charge of the actual convent. The prioress, musically speaking, could do a little bit more than the average nun. They could incite some vesicles, canticles, things like that. The abbess obviously could actually recite an intone chant on a feast day, which was part of her leadership role. The cantrix is interesting. If you think about a cantor in church today who stands up in front of the congregation and leads the singing prayers, that is very much what a cantrix would do. So a cantrix was in charge of setting the intonation, setting the key, for lack of a better word. There wasn't really a key signature in the days of chant, but there was certainly a tone you could call do, or a note you could refer to as do. And that was their job to sort of set the key. It was also their job to set the tempo. It was their job to choose soloists. It was their job to choose the chants for all the different days. And it was their job to make sure that the books stayed in good condition and were collected after each communal activity. So there are a couple different roles, but nothing certainly that was as high level as, say, a priest or bishop. They were always in charge of the nuns that were working in their nearby convents. So what's interesting about Hildegard is she is really largely credited with being the inventor of what we call liturgical dramas. They're also known as sacred music dramas or religious dramas. And the idea here is that it was a drama acted out by the nuns in the convent. Often they were priests involved. The other priests or monks that would have been attached to their convent would also often play roles in these liturgical dramas. And sometimes they were biblical stories acted out. Sometimes they were stories of the saints. In Hildegard's case, it was a little bit different, and it had a more thematic sort of approach, and we'll get to that. But for example, a liturgical drama on, say, Easter Sunday, there would have been 3 nuns playing the part of the 3 Marys. The priests on hand, of course, would have been playing the role of Jesus Christ, and also the angels and the more important, quote-unquote, members of that story. So Hildegard, she is the OG, the original gangster of female musicians, at least in the Western world. She was revolutionary in many, many ways. She's considered the first really female composer where we have actual music that she wrote in our hands. There likely were many more women who were composing at this time, but we don't necessarily have record of that. So Hildegard is a little bit fascinating in that she had the forethought to write things down. And they were preserved by the government, by the German government. She's largely credited with being one of the founders of German natural history, which is very interesting. She was also a mystic. She wrote many things, including a book of visions. She was considered to be a visionary. She was a philosopher. She was also a physician. She believed a great deal in natural medicine and holistic healing. In other words, things that come from the Creator, come from the earth, were all sort of part of her physical, the idea of spirituality and physicality sort of melding together. It's the idea that all of these things come from the earth and are given to us as gifts from the earth, from the Creator. She was also a poet, and an herbalist, obviously, because she knew quite a great deal about what was given to us by nature and what could heal us, and also, of course, what could hurt us. She was a polymath. She was a very intelligent woman, and as a result, she was sought out by many heads of state as an advisor. She also made quite a few enemies within the church, as you might imagine, because she wrote some very strong worded letters to her bosses about things that she greatly disagreed with. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But you can see here a picture of her having a vision, writing it down. Although she did not do the bulk of the writing, she actually involved a scribe by the name of Volmar, not to be confused with Voldemort. Volmar was a monk that she sort of enlisted to help her write down her various visions and other things that sort of came to her. We're not really sure why she had these visions. Some people suspect that she was the victim of political poisoning. Some people suspect Oliver Sacks, for one, the neurologist and sort of musicologist that has written about the music in the brain. He says very clearly he thought she had migraines and was experiencing what we call aura. And as a migraine sufferer, there's a lot of delusions that sort of happen when you're in a lot of pain, so that may not be far off. Some also think that she had lead poisoning from being confined in a very small place with, of course, quite a lot of lead. So we're not really sure why she had these visions, but certainly she believed that they were of God and that they were coming from a very spiritual place. So she wrote and staged her first liturgical drama around 1150. She also wrote many, many chants, liturgical songs, poems, morality plays, and we'll talk about one, probably the most famous one specifically a little later. And then, of course, her books of illuminations, which were her visions. She wrote 3 of these books, compilations, which also included a lot of chant, plain chant, as we call it, her liturgical songs, which were sometimes written just for what we call in one line of music. So monophony, occasionally polyphonic, written for 2 parts, plain chant in 2 parts, often separated by the interval of a 4th or a 5th. But there are many different things that she did that made it very dramatic. A little bit about her. She was thought of as a leader by her fellow nuns. So in 1136, she was named or elected what we call magistra of a small convent that was attached to a monastery. So she obviously had another boss. But her nuns obviously thought very highly of her. And this happened after one of her very close friends, confidants, her superior, and her roommate, Jutta, passed away in 1136. And after that, then Hildegard was named magistra. Her roommate, Jutta, that we talk about, was very influential in her life. Many people think that they had an interesting relationship, more than just leader and follower. She was definitely very influential. She also was a mystic and had visions, and trained her to, in some cases, write music and to play some instruments. She was mostly self-taught, but certainly her roommate had a lot of influence over her in terms of her musical well-being. A few years after that, she decided she wanted a little more autonomy, and she didn't necessarily want to be connected to a male monastery, so she moved about 20 of her nuns to a town called Rupertsberg and founded a convent there. And she also brought her scribe, Volmar, which is where she did the bulk of her work on her vision. She didn't actually start talking publicly about her visions until age 42. She was very ashamed of it. She thought perhaps that there was something wrong with her, and she didn't know exactly how to broach the subject with her fellow nuns. But finally, at the age of 42, she had a specific vision where God came to her and said, "You need to write these things down." And that sort of began that part of her life. So these visions, you can see here, she was very sickly as a child, which is where these visions began. They began as early as the age of 5, and she often saw them when she was very ill. As I said, at the age of 42, she finally decided to write them down, and she says that that was a directive from God. And then Volmar, of course, aided her in this. You can see from these visions, we have many of them in print form now. which are protected by the German government in museums and things like that. But in many ways, we believe these to be extremely feminist, sort of exploring the ways of the woman. So, and that has to do in a lot of ways with our sexuality and our relationship with God, our relationship with man, our relationship with the spiritual, as well as the earth. So I encourage you to look up some more of her visions and dig a little bit deeper, because they are extremely fascinating and also very beautiful. So her music, what's interesting about her music is that, as I said, it was essentially plain chant, but we saw some divergence. We saw some 2-part, some 3-part, and of course this would all have been written for women, right? Female singers. And she's really considered to be the most influential female composer of the Middle Ages, simply because we have the proof and we actually have the manuscripts. Her most famous liturgical play, and this is the one I wanted to talk about the most, is called Ordo Virtutum. She wrote this in about 1151, shortly after moving to Würzburg. It literally means Order of the Virtues, and this is a morality play, liturgical drama. There are other versions of this found in other publications written by Hildegard. One of her vision books is called Civias, and there's a shorter version of Ordo Virtutum in that particular book, but we also see parts of it in her liturgical songs and other things like that, where she sort of excerpted some of her chant melodies from this larger work. And this larger work is in this, basically is the scope of about 5 parts put together, all sort of outlining the different virtues. There are 17 virtues, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about that in a little bit. She also wrote a collection of about 70 liturgical songs, and we see some of those coming out of Ordo Virtutum as well, and that is called the Symphony of Harmony of Celestial Revelations. So let's talk about Ordo. So Ordo, as I said, has no biblical plot per se. Many others did. Many other morality plays did. But in this case, it's really about Hildegard's theoretical knowledge of theology and what she considers to be theology. In other words, our relationship between the earth and the Creator, and our souls and our Creator. Essentially, it's all plain chant, as I said before. 82 melodies, though, in all. What's interesting about this is that the 17 virtues are all played by different nuns. We're all played by women. There's, of course, a chorus of patriarchs, saints, prophets. That, of course, is a male chorus. The chorus of souls is played by women. And what I find really interesting is that she cast the devil as a man. And this was probably played by the priest in her area. And the devil has no singing part, because Hildegard did not believe that the devil was actually capable of creating harmonious sounds. So all the devil does is grunt and yell during this whole episode. So as each of the 17 virtues sort of display themselves to the soul, and in all of this drama comes the pull of earthly delights or sin, and that would be the devil. And so as the virtues are displaying themselves to the soul, the devil is interrupting and trying to distract and pull the soul away from the virtues. Finally, at the end, the virtues bind the devil and conquer evil, basically, through virtuous living. And the final section, section 5, is praising God because that happened. So very interesting. I will attach a link right here, as you can see. There are a couple different performances on YouTube by various churches and various professional choirs and things like that. It's quite long, so I won't play any of it here, but I hope that you will take a listen on your own and Do a little research on Hildegard of Bingen, also known as Saint Hildegard. She was extremely influential, not only as a musician, but also as a woman. A great story about her is when one of her parishioners in Rupertsburg was excommunicated. The church wanted to exhume his body and move it to another plot of land because he was excommunicated. And Hildegard fought tooth and nail to make sure that that didn't happen, even going so far to go over her boss's head and write many, many very stern letters saying how this person should continue to be buried in Rupertsburg, and she got her way. So we can learn a lot from Hildegard and her strength. She, of course, was punished for that. Music was banned for a little while. She was not allowed to make any music in her convent as a result of her standing her ground. But of course, there's always a little bit of pain when we make some reasonable strides, and that's what she did for us. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I will do another lecture in the coming week on women of the Renaissance. So I hope to see you back then. Thank you so much. Have a great day and stay healthy.